Follow my story until the end. And drop a comment telling me what city or town you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this reaches across New Zealand and beyond. There I was, standing in the glass-walled foyer of Hargreaves Pacific Tower on a Tuesday morning, wearing a rain jacket that had seen better days and carrying a paper bag from the bakery down on Lambton Quay. Steam was rising from the coffee cup balanced in my other hand, and I'd just stepped in a puddle near the revolving door, so my left shoe was making that embarrassing squeak with every step. I was 63 years old, and in that moment, I looked every bit of it. That's when I heard her voice. "For goodness sake, Graham." I turned. My wife, we'd been married 31 years, was standing near the reception desk in a cream blazer I didn't recognize, her handbag probably worth more than my first car. Beside her stood a man I'd met only twice before, both times at functions she'd dragged me to and then spent the evening apologizing to people for my presence. His name was Philip. He was 54, silver-haired, the kind of man who wore his confidence like a second suit. "I told you I had a meeting here this morning," she said, her voice dropping to that particular register she reserved for when she was embarrassed by me. "I didn't expect you to actually show up looking like you'd just come from fixing a fence." Philip said nothing. He smiled, just slightly. The way people smile when they've already won something and they know it. "I'm picking up some documents," I said. "Won't take long." Documents. She said the word like it tasted strange. "Graham, do you even know what building this is?" I looked around at the marble flooring, the digital display above the lifts listing tenants on 38 floors, the young receptionist pretending not to hear any of this. "I know exactly what building it is," I said. She looked at Philip. Something passed between them, not words, just that particular shorthand that people develop when they've spent enough time together. Then she turned back to me with the expression I'd grown used to over the last several years. Patient, tired, faintly pitying. "We have a 9 o'clock, she said. "Please don't embarrass me." They walked toward the lifts together. I watched them go. Then I finished my coffee, folded the paper bag under my arm, and took the lift to the 36th floor. I want to tell you something about the kind of man I was, so you understand how all of this came to be. I grew up in Palmerston North, the second of 3 sons. Father worked at the freezing works. Mother cleaned houses on weekends to make the mortgage. We weren't poor by any catastrophic measure, but money was always the background noise of our house, the hum you stopped hearing but never really forgot. I left school at 17, worked on a cousin's orchard for 2 seasons, then got a job as a clerk at a small investment firm in Wellington because I was decent at numbers and willing to work longer hours than anyone else in the office. That firm was called Tyndall and Sorensen. It no longer exists under that name, but the structure it became, the network of interests it evolved into over 4 decades that still exists. And for the last 22 years, I have been its primary beneficial owner, not its face, not its spokesman, not the person quoted in the business section or photographed at charity galas. I am a very private man with a very old-fashioned belief that the less people know about what you own, the better you sleep at night. My wife knew I had money. She knew I'd done well. What she didn't know, what I'd never seen fit to tell her, and what she'd never cared enough to ask about in any serious way, was the actual scale of it. When she looked at me, she saw the rain jacket and the bakery bag and the squeaky shoe. She saw the version of me I'd always preferred to present to the world. Quiet, unremarkable, easy to underestimate. For a long time, I told myself that her not knowing was simply a matter of privacy, of keeping business separate from marriage. But somewhere in the last decade, I had started to understand that the real reason I'd never told her was because I was waiting to see if she would love the version of me she could see. She didn't. The trouble had been building for years, the way weather builds over the Cook Strait, slowly, then suddenly. Then you're already in it before you've properly noticed. Our son was grown and living in Melbourne. Our daughter had her own life in Christchurch. The house we shared in Kandala was beautiful and largely silent. I cooked most evenings because I enjoyed it. She attended events most evenings because she enjoyed them. We occupied the same rooms the way two pieces of furniture can occupy the same room, present, functional, and entirely unrelated to each other's purpose. The distance had grown so gradually that I couldn't point to a single moment when it started. But I could point to the moment I knew it was irreversible. It was a Sunday afternoon about 4 years before any of this. I'd been in the garden all morning and come inside to find her on the phone in the kitchen, laughing in a way I hadn't heard in years. Not the polite laugh she used at functions, or the tired laugh she used with the children. This was a real laugh, low and warm. The laugh of someone who felt genuinely, completely at ease. She didn't hear me come in. I stood in the doorway for perhaps 30 seconds, listening to her be happy, and then I went back outside and sat on the bench beside the vegetable beds and understood that the happiness I was listening to had nothing to do with me. I didn't confront her then. Maybe I should have. Instead, I did what I had always done. I went quiet, and I thought, and I waited to see what would become of things. What became of things, over the following 2 years, was that Philip appeared more frequently at the edges of our life. He was a commercial property developer, which meant his work and my wife's work. She was a senior partner at an architecture firm, overlapped naturally. She mentioned his name with a casualness that had obviously been practiced. She stayed late at the office on evenings that I later came to understand weren't late nights at the office at all. I'm not going to dwell on the details of her affair because they're not the point of this story. The point is that I knew, and she didn't know that I knew. And I spent those 2 years not being angry, or rather, not only being angry, but deciding what kind of ending I wanted this to have. I had a good lawyer. Her name was Frances Holt, and she'd been working with me on the business side of things for 15 years. When I first came to her with what I was considering, she looked at me over her reading glasses for a long moment and then said, "You've already decided, haven't you?" It wasn't a question. I said yes. She said, "Then let's make sure it's done properly." There were 2 things I needed to accomplish. The first was the divorce settlement. My wife's name was on nothing, not out of deception, but because that was simply how I'd structured things for decades before we even married. The family home was jointly owned. Everything else was mine, held through structures that were entirely legal and entirely invisible to anyone who wasn't looking specifically for them. Frances and I worked for several months on an arrangement that was fair, genuinely fair, not punishingly minimal, but that also did not require me to expose the full breadth of what I owned to someone who had spent the better part of a decade treating me as an inconvenience. The second thing was the meeting on the 36th floor. Philip's development company had been trying for 2 years to secure a partner for a large mixed-use project on the Wellington waterfront. The project required significant capital and a co-investor with the right kind of portfolio. Through a series of intermediaries, none of whom connected the thread back to me, his company had eventually been introduced to a private investment vehicle called Kowai Capital. Negotiations had proceeded over several months. A framework agreement had been drafted. The meeting on that Tuesday morning was the signing. Kowai Capital was mine. I had said nothing about this to anyone outside of Frances and my small team. My wife had no idea that the investment partner, her lover, had been courting for 2 years. The one he'd described to her over dinners and weekend conversations as the piece that makes this whole thing work was her own husband. The lift opened on 36, and I walked down the corridor to the suite at the end. My assistant, a steady and professionally imperturbable man named Warren, who had been with me for 11 years, was waiting near the entrance with a folder and a look that told me everything had been arranged as discussed. The conference room through the glass partition was set up. Water on the table, documents in folders, the long mahogany table with 4 chairs, and at the head of the table, facing the door, the chair where I would sit. "They're in reception," Warren said. About 3 minutes. Good, I said. I put down the paper bag and took off my rain jacket. Underneath it, I was wearing a suit that had been made for me by a tailor in Auckland 18 months earlier. Not flashy, not designed to announce anything, just a very good suit on a 63-year-old man who had long ago stopped needing to perform. I went into the conference room, sat down at the head of the table, and opened my copy of the documents. Warren showed them in. I heard her voice before I saw her, the same tone she'd used in the foyer, explaining something to Philip, that particular cadence of a person who is used to being the most competent person in any given room. Then they came through the door, and she stopped. Philip stopped behind her. The room was very quiet. She looked at me. I looked at her. I said nothing. I didn't need to. There's a particular quality to silence in moments like that one. Not empty, but dense. Like the air before a storm rolls in off the harbor. She was trying to process several things simultaneously, and I could see them moving across her face the way clouds move. Confusion first, then the beginning of understanding, then something I can only describe as a complete recalibration of the last several years. Philip recovered faster. He was a businessman, after all. He said my name, not Diem, but Mr. Callahan, because the briefing notes Francis's team had arranged for Kauai Capital's principal investor had included my full name, and he was putting it together in real time. "You're he," started. "The person you've been trying to get a meeting with for 2 years," I said. "Yes. Please. Sit down." My wife sat. I think her legs made the decision before the rest of her caught up. We spent the next 40 minutes working through the agreement. I want to be clear. The deal was real. The project was sound. I'd had it properly assessed by 2 independent analysts, and Francis had reviewed every clause. I wasn't there to sabotage anything. I was there because it was my company. And this was my meeting. And I had every legitimate reason to be in that chair. But I won't pretend there wasn't something else present in that room as well. About halfway through, Philip excused himself to take a call. My wife and I sat across the table from each other. And for the first time in years, she looked at me the way you look at something when you've suddenly realized you've been misreading it from the beginning. "How long?" she said. Not accusatory. Not angry. Just quiet. "Kauai Capital?" "About 12 years. "No," she said. "How long have you known about us?" I looked at her steadily. "About 3 years." She pressed her lips together and looked out the window at the harbor. The ferry was cutting across toward the Inter-Islander terminal. White wake, spreading behind it in the gray water. "Why didn't you say anything?" "I was waiting," I said. "For what?" I thought about how to answer that. "To see what you'd choose," I said finally. "If I told you, the choice would be about me. About what I had, what I could offer. This way the choice was about you, about who you actually were." She didn't say anything to that. Philip came back, and we completed the meeting, and everyone shook hands, and they left. I sat at the table for a while after, looking out at the same view she'd been looking at, the harbor and the hills and the cold, clear Wellington sky. Francis had the papers ready that afternoon. The settlement we'd prepared was this: the family home, which she'd always loved more than I had anyway. A sum that covered the inheritance funds she'd contributed to the household in the early years of our marriage returned to her in full, with interest that accounted for what that money would reasonably have earned over time. An income arrangement for 5 years. Tapering. To give her time to fully transition. Her superannuation. Untouched. Her car, which she'd bought herself. No claim on Kauai Capital. No claim on the businesses, the properties, the structures beneath. Fair, I believed. Her lawyer looked at it for 2 weeks and came back saying she agreed it was fair and that my wife had instructed her to proceed without contest. I moved into a small apartment in Mount Victoria that I'd owned for years and used occasionally when I worked late. It suited me better than I'd expected. I learned to be quiet in a different way, not the silence of a man waiting for something, but the silence of a man who had finally stopped waiting. My daughter called the week after I moved in. She'd heard from her mother. She was upset. And I let her be upset. And I listened. And I told her that the most important thing to understand was that both her parents were going to be all right and that nothing about this changed anything between us. "Dad," she said, "were you actually the whole time?" "Yes," I said. There was a long pause. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" "I told you what mattered," I said. "I told you to work hard and be honest and look after the people who looked after you. Whether I had a lot of money or a little money doesn't change any of that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mom said you were fair." "I tried to be," I said. My son called a few days later. He was less upset and more analytical about it, which is very much his nature. He asked practical questions. I answered them. At the end of the call, he said, "You know, when I was a teenager, I used to be embarrassed that you weren't like other dads. You didn't drive flash cars or go on about what you did. I thought it meant you hadn't done much." "I know," I said. "I think I understand it better now." "You'll understand it even better in another 20 years, I said. That's how most things work. I still walk down to the bakery on Lambton Quay most mornings. I still wear the rain jacket when the southerly is coming in. I still take the lift to 36 when there's business to attend to, and I sit in the chair at the head of the table, and I do the work that I've always done. Philip's waterfront project is proceeding. It's a good project. The agreement stands. That's as it should be. Business is business, and I don't carry grudges into commercial relationships. Life is too short, and the work too important. My wife and I see each other occasionally. At family gatherings, when the children are home. We are civil. We are even, I think, beginning to be something approaching friendly, in the careful, considered way that people can be when they've put down something heavy and both recovered some of their strength. She looks well. I hope she's happy. I genuinely mean that. There are a few things I've come to understand more clearly on this side of all of it, and I want to share them with you, because perhaps they're useful. The first is that allowing someone to underestimate you is not the same as being weak. Strength doesn't require an audience. Some of the most capable people I've known in 63 years have also been the quietest, not because they had nothing to say, but because they'd learned that doing the work matters more than announcing it. The second is that the most important choices we make in relationships are usually not made in the dramatic moments. They're made in the ordinary ones, in whether you choose honesty or convenience, attentiveness or distraction, kindness or contempt. My wife and I made our choices across thousands of ordinary days, and the dramatic moment in that conference room was just the result of all those smaller ones finally arriving somewhere. The third is about fairness. When everything fell apart, I could have used what I knew to hurt her badly. I chose not to. Not because I'm a particularly noble person, but because the way you end things becomes part of who you are afterward. I didn't want to carry that weight. If you ever find yourself deciding how to end something that's broken, a marriage, a partnership, a friendship, I would ask you to think about the person you want to be when it's over, and let that guide what you do. And the last thing is simply this. It is never too late to start living honestly. I spent too many years being someone I thought the world could handle instead of the full version of myself. The jacket and the bakery bag weren't a disguise. Exactly, they were genuinely me. That part of me was real. But they were also a way of avoiding the conversation I needed to have. Letting people see you, truly see you, requires courage. I wish I'd had more of it earlier. If you're watching from somewhere in New Zealand tonight, from Wellington in the wind, from Christchurch rebuilding, from Auckland in all its noise, from a small town in Southland or the Waikato or the top of the South Island, I hope some part of this story felt true to you, not because it's your story, but because the things underneath it are universal. What it means to be seen, what it costs to be patient, and what it feels like when something long overdue finally, quietly, arrives. Thank you for listening. If this reached you, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or town in the comments below. And if you know someone who might need to hear something like this today, please share it with them.